Get your trash out of my facility. Roger, you're done here. The new VP smirked, tossing my 26-year employee file into the bin. I didn't raise my voice, I just smiled, logged into the terminal, and pressed delete. Within hours, their entire multi-million-dollar assembly line stopped cold. For 26 years, the rhythmic, bone-rattling thud of Plant 4 was the soundtrack of my life. It was a mechanical heartbeat that echoed through a 60,000-square-foot facility of reinforced concrete and structural steel. I started at Miller Precision Automotive back in the spring of 2000. Back then, Leonard Miller, the founder, still walked the production floor in grease-stained canvas overalls, shaking hands with the machinists and listening to the high-frequency whine of the bearings. I was just 26 myself, fresh out of the State University with a degree in industrial systems engineering and a pocket full of ideas that most old-school shops laughed at. Leonard didn't laugh. He looked at my sketches, patted my shoulder, and told me that if I could make the stamping presses run smoother, I would have a home here for as long as I wanted. I took him at his word. I spent the next quarter of a century living and breathing the calibration of heavy industrial machinery. By the time I turned 52, I knew every vibration, every hydraulic valve lag, and every temperature fluctuation in Plant 4. My official title was Chief Plant Engineer, but to the guys on the floor, I was the machine whisperer. If the massive 2,500-ton Schuler hydraulic stamping presses, specifically the 4 Model S4 to these 2,500 units that formed the backbone of our assembly line, had a hiccup, I was the one who diagnosed it. Those presses were mechanical monsters. They stamped raw sheets of high-strength, low-alloy steel into high-precision automotive chassis parts for the Detroit Auto Consortium, a contract that brought in $28 million in annual revenue for the company, accounting for a massive chunk of our total $84 million in annual recurring revenue. The tolerances required for these chassis parts were razor-thin. We were talking about a deviation margin of less than 0.001 inches. If the stamping die hit the steel sheet with even a fraction of a millisecond of delay, or if the hydraulic pressure distribution was off by a single bar, the metal would tear, or worse, the $450,000 custom tool steel's dies would develop microfractures and shatter under the heat. Standard factory settings from Schuler allowed these presses to run at a conservative 18 strokes per minute. It was a safe speed, but it limit-tested the physical properties of the machinery. Over time, as production demands grew, I realized we could optimize the lines. In 2014, after spending 3 months of sleepless nights analyzing the PID control loops that govern the proportional flow valves of the hydraulic cylinders, I developed a custom firmware configuration. I wrote a proprietary algorithm that performed real-time, high-frequency micro-adjustments to the pressure feedback loop, compensating for thermal expansion of the mechanical components as they heated up during long production runs. My code didn't just speed up the presses, it made them run cooler and reduce tool wear by 40%. I knew the value of what I had created. Instead of just handing it over, I registered it with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. In late 2014, I was granted U.S. Patent number 9,845,312 for a high-frequency pressure stabilization logic for heavy stamping presses. When Leonard Miller found out about the patent, he didn't try to steal it. He was a businessman of the old school. He sat me down in his office, poured 2 glasses of bourbon, and offered me a deal. We signed a formal licensing agreement. Under the terms of that 2014 contract, Miller Precision Automotive was granted a non-transferable exclusive license to run my patented PLC firmware configuration on the 4 Schuler presses at Plant 4. The licensing fee was a symbolic $1 per year. However, there was a crucial legal clause that Leonard insisted on putting in to protect me. Clause 14B of the agreement stated that the validity of the license was strictly contingent upon my active, full-time employment as the chief plant engineer of Miller Precision Automotive. If my employment was terminated for any reason other than voluntary retirement or resignation with a 90-day transition period, the patent license would automatically self-terminate within 48 hours of my departure. The contract further specified that any continued operation of the stamping presses using the patented software logic after the 48-hour grace period would constitute willful patent infringement, subject to statutory damages under Title 35 of the United States Code, Section 271, with liquidated damages set at $150,000 for every single day of unauthorized operation. For 12 years, that contract sat in a secure drawer undisturbed. The company grew, the presses ran flawlessly at 18 strokes per minute, and we never missed a shipment. But in late 2024, at the age of 72, Leonard Miller decided it was time to step down. He sold his controlling interest to a private equity consortium, and a new board of directors took the reins. That was when the corporate climate changed. The grease-stained overalls were replaced by high-end Italian suits, and the focus shifted from engineering quality to short-term cost-cutting metrics. In early 2025, the board hired Brad Caldwell as the new vice president of operations. Brad was 41, a man who had never spent a single night shift listening to the hum of a factory floor. He was a numbers guy, obsessed with operational efficiency and maximizing margins to secure his own performance-based bonuses, which were tied to increasing quarterly plant output by at least 30%. From the first week Brad arrived, he looked at me like I was a dinosaur. He saw my 52-year-old face, my silver gray hair, and my salary, and he saw an easy target for cost reduction. He didn't understand that the reason the plant ran so smoothly wasn't because the machines were new, but because they were tuned to perfection by a system I had built and maintained with 26 years of tribal knowledge. Brad didn't care about tribal knowledge. He cared about spreadsheets, and on his spreadsheets, I was a high-cost line item that needed to be optimized out of existence. He wanted the machines to run faster, and he wanted to pay the person running them a lot less. He had no idea that he was about to pull the pin on a financial grenade. The tension reached a boiling point on a hot Tuesday morning in July. I was in the maintenance office, reviewing the vibration analysis reports for the S4-2500 presses, when Brad Caldwell walked in, accompanied by two young guys in identical cheap suits who looked like they had just graduated from business school. Brad didn't bother to knock. He walked straight to my desk, tossed a spreadsheet in front of me, and leaned over the metal frame of my workspace. He told me that starting the following Monday, we were going to run the stamping lines at 26 strokes per minute. He said the Detroit Auto Consortium contract was demanding a 30% increase in delivery volumes for the next quarter. And he wasn't going to let a bunch of old machines stand in the way of the company's targets. He wanted the speed increased immediately, and he didn't want to hear any excuses. I looked at the numbers on the sheet. Brad had calculated the increase in output without factoring in a single physical constraint of the machinery. I stood up, walked over to the schematic diagram of the Schuler presses pinned to the wall, and pointed to the hydraulic manifold assembly. I explained to him that at 18 strokes per minute, the high-strength steel sheets we were stamping generated a massive amount of kinetic heat. Our custom cooling cycles were tuned to dissipate that heat between strokes. If we overclocked the presses to 26 strokes per minute, the cycle time would drop from 3.3 seconds to 2.3 seconds. The tool steel dies, which cost $450,000 per set, wouldn't have enough time to cool down. The thermal stress would cause microfractures in the precision-cut edges of the die within 12 hours of continuous operation. Once those dies cracked, we wouldn't just lose production time. We would destroy the tooling, and the parts would fail the 0.001-inch tolerance check, resulting in a total rejection of the batch by the Detroit Auto Consortium. Brad didn't look at the schematics. He just scoffed, crossing his arms and smirking. He told me that I was always hiding behind technical jargon to justify my lazy pace. He said that modern manufacturing was about aggressive targets, not babysitting old machines. He accused me of being obsolete, claiming that I was simply afraid of change because my old-school methods couldn't keep up with a modern, high-speed corporate environment. I kept my voice flat. I told him that the physics of metal and heat didn't care about his corporate targets. I told him that if he ran those presses at 26 strokes per minute without a complete redesign of the hydraulic cooling system, he would shut down the entire plant within 48 hours. That was when Brad's smirk turned into a cold, arrogant sneer. He reached into his leather portfolio, pulled out a thick document, and slapped it down on my desk. He told me that he was tired of my insubordination and my constant roadblocks. He said the board had given him full authority to restructure the operations department to eliminate inefficiencies. He told me that my services were no longer required, effective immediately. He didn't stop there. He pointed to one of the young men standing behind him, a 28-year-old kid named Kevin, who looked nervous and wouldn't meet my eye. Brad told me that Kevin's third-party consulting firm had been hired to take over the plant operations. Kevin was going to manage the systems at less than half of my salary, and they were going to implement the speed-up plan without my obsolete interference. I looked at the termination papers. The package was standard, 12 months of severance pay, which was the bare minimum required by my contract. But there was an additional 3-page document attached to the back. It was an intellectual property waiver, a document that would transfer all rights, patents, and software codes developed during my tenure at Miller Precision Automotive to the company. I slid the IP waiver back across the desk to him. I told him that I would sign the standard termination agreement to finalize my departure, but I would not sign the intellectual property waiver. Brad laughed, a loud, grating sound that echoed out into the hallway where several technicians were standing, listening to the shouting. He told me that I didn't have a choice. He claimed that anything I wrote or built while working at the plant belonged to the company under standard work-for-hire doctrine. He warned me that if I didn't sign it, they would withhold my severance pay and tie me up in court until I was broke. I took out my pen, signed the main termination page, and left the IP waiver blank. I looked Brad dead in the eye and told him that he should consult the company's legal department and ask them to look up the 2014 licensing agreement signed by Leonard Miller before he made threats he couldn't back up. I told him that my custom PLC firmware was registered under a personal patent and was leased to the company under a contract that was explicitly tied to my active employment. Brad didn't even look at the paper. He just grabbed the signed termination sheet, stuffed it into his portfolio, and told me that he didn't care about some ancient, dusty agreement from 12 years ago. He said the company owned the plant, they owned the machines, and they owned the code running them. He told me I had 2 hours to pack my personal belongings and get out of his facility. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "Understood." I walked out of the office and down to the production floor. I packed my personal calibration tools, my engineering journals, and my coffee mug into a small cardboard box. As I walked past the control room, I logged into the primary industrial server terminal one last time using my admin credentials. I didn't delete any files, and I didn't plant any malicious code. I simply initiated the automated registration check system. The system was programmed to ping my employee ID in the active corporate directory database every 48 hours to verify the license validity. Since Brad's HR department would deactivate my employee profile by the end of the day, the next automated check on Thursday morning would find my ID deleted. The moment that database check returned a null result, the proprietary pressure stabilization algorithm would automatically delicense itself, reverting the Schuler presses to their default, unoptimized factory settings. I walked out of the heavy metal doors of Plant 4 at exactly 10 a.m. on Tuesday. The 48-hour countdown had officially begun, and Brad Caldwell had no idea that he had just signed the death warrant of his own career. On Wednesday morning, 24 hours after my departure, the plant was buzzing with artificial energy. From my kitchen table, where I sat drinking coffee and reviewing my patent documentation, I could almost picture what was happening. Brad Caldwell had wasted no time. He had ordered Kevin, the junior consultant, to override the safety parameters I had established and crank the 4 Schuler S4 2500 presses up to 26 strokes per minute. For the first day, the numbers looked spectacular on Brad's digital dashboard. The stamping lines were hammering out parts at an unprecedented rate, and Brad spent his afternoon sending emails to the board of directors, boasting about how his aggressive management style had unlocked a 30% increase in throughput within 24 hours of removing the obsolete chief plant engineer. He even attached a PDF report showing a projected cost savings of $80,000 in annual engineering salaries. The board, sitting in their glass offices in Chicago, sent back congratulatory replies, congratulating Brad on his decisive action. But back in Plant 4, the machines were crying out. One of the old lead maintenance technicians, a guy named Henry, who had worked with me for 15 years, texted me that afternoon. He said the hydraulic fluid temperatures on Press 1 and Press 2 were spiking into the red zone, reaching 85 degrees Celsius, well above the safe operating limit of 65 degrees. He said the machines were vibrating so violently that the anchor bolts in the concrete floor were starting to loosen. I texted him back with a simple message. Stay safe, Henry. Wear your safety gear and keep your distance from the manifolds. At exactly 10 a.m. on Thursday, the 48-hour clock expired. Deep within the industrial server rack in the control room, the automated license verification script initiated its scheduled query. It scanned the Active Directory database of Miller Precision Automotive, searching for my employee registration ID, Vance 9024. The query returned a null value. My profile had been deleted by the HR software at 5 p.m. the previous evening, just as Brad had ordered. The license script did exactly what it was programmed to do. Having failed to verify the active employment of the patent holder, the software revoked the authorization key for the custom PLC firmware. The control system immediately deactivated my proprietary high-frequency pressure stabilization algorithm. Without the custom PID loops to manage the proportional valves and thermal expansion, the 4 massive Schuler presses defaulted back to their basic unoptimized factory configurations. But there was a catch. Because my custom code was no longer active to stabilize the high-speed pressure fluctuations. The factory safety firmware detected the extreme thermal buildup and the pressure spikes that had occurred during the 26 SPM run. To prevent a catastrophic failure of the main hydraulic cylinders, the safety protocols automatically throttled the presses down to a legacy baseline speed of 10 strokes per minute. The change was instantaneous and deafening. The rapid, aggressive rhythm of the stamping floor suddenly slowed to a sluggish, painful crawl. The output of Plant 4 collapsed from 14,000 stamped chassis parts per day to just 6,000. Brad Caldwell was in the middle of a meeting with the regional sales managers when the news hit. He ran down to the production floor, his face red, screaming at Kevin to turn the speed back up. Kevin, sitting at the control console with sweat dripping onto his keyboard, was panicking. He explained that the custom stabilization code was gone, and the system was locked in safety fallback mode. Every time he tried to manually force the speed back to 26 strokes per minute, the PLC rejected the command, citing a lack of license authorization for the high-speed pressure calibration algorithms. Brad, completely ignorant of the technical realities, grabbed the keyboard. He told Kevin that he was paying him to bypass these technical blocks. He ordered him to write a hard override command to bypass the thermal safety checks and force the hydraulic valves to stay open longer regardless of the feedback loop. Kevin, terrified of losing his consulting contract, did what he was told. He wrote a raw command line that bypassed the PLC safety interlocks, forcing press line 1 to run at 26 strokes per minute without any of the active pressure stabilization. It took exactly 47 minutes for the machine to break. Without my patented algorithm to perform the microsecond adjustments to the hydraulic pressure as the metal heated up, the pressure inside the main cylinder spiked to an astronomical 400 bar. The tool steel die, running at 88 degrees Celsius, hit a cold sheet of steel with a massive, uneven force. A sound like a cannon shot echoed through Plant 4. The main hydraulic manifold seal ruptured, spraying hot, pressurized oil 20 feet into the air. At the same instant, the $450,000 custom stamping die on Press 1 cracked clean in half, sending a chunk of shattered tool steel flying into the safety cage. Press Line 1 was dead. The remaining 3 presses were immediately shut down by the operators who refused to work near the spraying oil. The entire assembly floor went dead silent. Brad Caldwell stood in the middle of the oil-slicked concrete, staring at the ruined machine. The Detroit Auto Consortium contract had a strict just-in-time delivery clause. For every day we failed to deliver the 14,000 chassis parts, we were subject to a penalty of $320,000. And with press line 1 destroyed, and the other 3 lines locked at 10 strokes per minute, we were facing a massive daily deficit. The crisis had officially arrived, and it was costing the company thousands of dollars with every tick of the clock. By Friday morning, the situation at Miller Precision Automotive had escalated from an operational failure to a full-blown corporate catastrophe. The Detroit Auto Consortium had already sent a formal notice of non-compliance. Their assembly plants in Michigan were running on just-in-time inventory, and the lack of chassis parts from Plant 4 was threatening to shut down their entire SUV production line. They warned MPA that if the full daily quota of 14,000 parts was not restored by Monday morning, they would terminate the $28 million annual contract and sue for consequential damages. The board of directors called an emergency video conference. Brad Caldwell was on the call, sweating profusely in his high-end office, trying to spin the disaster. He claimed that I had committed corporate sabotage, that I had intentionally planted a virus or a logical bomb in the system before I was fired to destroy the machines. He demanded that the board authorize a lawsuit against me to force me to hand over the company's code. But the company's general counsel, Sarah Jennings, wasn't buying it. She had spent the last 24 hours reviewing the company archives, and she had pulled the original 2014 licensing agreement signed by Leonard Miller. She interrupted Brad in the middle of his tirade. She told the board that there was no sabotage, no virus, and no logical bomb. She explained that Roger Vance had simply built a license verification check into his proprietary software, which was a standard and legal practice to protect intellectual property. She read Clause 14b aloud to the board, explaining that the moment Brad terminated Roger without cause on Tuesday, the license agreement entered a 48-hour countdown. Sarah looked directly at Brad through the camera and told him that by running the presses after 10 a.m. on Thursday, the company had committed willful patent infringement under Title 35, Section 271 of the U.S. Code. She warned the board that the statutory damages for willful infringement could easily reach 3 times the actual damages, plus attorney fees. Furthermore, the contract Brad had signed with the junior consulting firm showed that they had manually overridden the safety limits, which voided the insurance policy on the $450,000 stamping die that had shattered. The company was entirely liable, not only for the ruined die and the $320,000 daily contract penalties, but also for a potential patent lawsuit that would halt all operations indefinitely. The board chairman, a cold-eyed investor named Richard Caldwell. Wait, Caldwell? Let's check the antagonist's name, Brad Caldwell. Are they related? Nepotism. Let's make Richard the board member who got Brad the job. Let's make them uncle and nephew. This adds to the drama. Wait, are their names on the forbidden list? Richard and Brad are not on the forbidden list. Let's make sure. The forbidden list does not contain Richard or Caldwell. Yes, Richard Caldwell tried to defend his nephew, suggesting they hire a different team to rewrite the software from scratch. Sarah Jennings laughed, a dry, humorless sound. She told Richard that a complete rewrite of a custom PLC firmware configuration for 4 20,500-ton hydraulic presses would require hiring Siemens Industrial Systems Division. She had already called them. Their estimate was $650,000, and they couldn't start for 3 weeks. In the meantime, the plant would have to run at the legacy 10 strokes per minute, which meant they would lose over $6 million in contract penalties. Before the new code was even loaded, the board chairman went silent. The other board members began to turn on Richard and Brad. They demanded that Brad call me immediately and resolve the issue, whatever it took. I was sitting in my backyard working on a wooden model ship when my phone began to ring. It was 2:00 p.m. on Friday. The caller ID showed Brad Caldwell's number. I let it ring. He called again 3 minutes later. I let it ring. He called 5 times in the span of 20 minutes. Each time, I simply watched the screen light up and went back to sanding the hull of my model. On the 6th call, I finally answered. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Brad's voice came through the speaker, tight, strained, and high-pitched. He didn't sound like the arrogant VP who had tossed my file into the trash anymore. He told me that we had an emergency at the plant, that press 1 was down, and that the system was locked. He told me that I needed to come back to the plant immediately, upload the calibration keys, and help the team restore the lines. He added, in a weak attempt to maintain authority, that if I refused, the company would hold me legally responsible for the lost production. I took a sip of my iced tea and spoke in a calm, measured tone. I told Brad that as of Tuesday morning, I was no longer an employee of Miller Precision Automotive. I was a private citizen, and I had no legal obligation to touch their servers or their machines. I reminded him that my patent license had expired on Thursday, and that any continued use of my code on the remaining 3 presses was a violation of federal patent law. I advised him to speak to Sarah Jennings before he made any more legal threats. Brad gasped, his breathing heavy over the phone. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I had already drafted the terms for my return, and I had emailed them to Sarah Jennings 10 minutes ago. I read them to him anyway. First, a formal, written apology from the board of directors for the unprofessional and wrongful terminations. Second, the immediate termination of Brad Caldwell for gross negligence and safety violations that resulted in the destruction of company property. Third, a new independent consulting contract for myself, Roger Vance, at a rate of $15,000 per day, with a minimum 10-day retainer paid in advance. Fourth, a new licensing agreement for the patented firmware configuration, at a rate of $120,000 per year, paid annually. Fifth, the immediate release of my 12-month severance package, doubled to $360,000 as specified under the wrongful termination clause of my original contract. Brad screamed. He called me a thief, a blackmailer, and an old dinosaur who was trying to extort the company. He swore that he would rather see the plant burned to the ground than agree to those terms. He slammed the phone down, ending the call. I smiled, hung up, and went back to my wooden ship. I knew that by Saturday morning, the board would realize that the cost of my demands, a total of $510,000 in immediate payments plus the annual license, was a drop in the bucket compared to the $10 million they stood to lose if the Detroit Auto Consortium canceled the contract. The clock was ticking, and Brad Caldwell's pride was the only thing standing between the company and financial ruin. And in the corporate world, pride is the first thing they throw overboard when the ship starts to sink. The call I was waiting for came on Saturday morning at exactly 9 a.m. This time it wasn't Brad Caldwell. The caller ID showed the corporate number for the chief executive officer of the private equity firm that owned Miller Precision Automotive, a man named Donald Henderson. Donald Henderson's voice was calm, tired, and completely professional. He didn't try to negotiate or make threats. He told me that he had Sarah Jennings on the line with him. He said the board had held an emergency vote at 8 a.m. They had reviewed the facts, the 2014 agreement, and the report on the destroyed stamping press. He told me that they had accepted all of my terms. He said that Brad Caldwell had been terminated for gross negligence and safety violations, effective immediately. His security badge had already been deactivated, and he had been escorted from the property by security. His uncle, Richard Caldwell, had been forced to recuse himself from the board operations and was currently facing an internal audit regarding nepotism and the hiring of the unqualified junior consulting firm. Donald Henderson sent over the signed consulting contract, the formal written apology from the board, and the wire transfer confirmation. By 10:30 a.m., my bank account showed a pending deposit of $510,000. $360,000 for my doubled severance, and $150,000 for the 10-day consulting retainer. The corporate accounting department had also initiated the first annual payment of $120,000 for the patent license. On Sunday morning at 8 a.m., I drove back into the parking lot of Plant 4. The air was cool, and the parking spot that had been marked with Brad Caldwell's name was empty. As I walked through the heavy metal doors with my toolbox, the shift supervisor and 3 of the lead technicians were standing by the break room. When they saw me, they didn't say anything, but they all nodded, and Henry gave me a quiet thumbs up. The corporate suits were gone, and the plant was ours again. I walked straight to the control room. The junior consultant, Kevin, was gone, his laptop and files cleared off the desk. I sat down at the main terminal, logged in with my restored administrator credentials, and loaded the patented pressure stabilization firmware back onto the server. I ran a full diagnostic check on the remaining 3 active Schuler presses. The thermal sensors on press 2 were still reading hot from Brad's overclocking attempt, but they were intact. I initiated the PID calibration sequence. As the software began to run, the mechanical thud of the presses changed. The harsh, metallic clanging faded, replaced by the deep, rhythmic, balanced thud that I had spent 26 years tuning. The 3 active lines throttled up to their optimized 18 strokes per minute, running smoothly and generating almost no excess heat. Even with press line 1 down, the 3 active presses running with my firmware were able to produce 10,500 chassis parts per day. I spent the next 4 days working side by side with Henry and the maintenance crew. We sourced a replacement die set from a specialized toolmaker in Ohio who had a blank in stock, and we rebuilt the manifold assembly on press 1. By Thursday morning, 9 days after I was fired, press line 1 was online. The plant was back to its full capacity of 14,000 parts per day. The Detroit Auto Consortium's representatives arrived that afternoon for an inspection. When they saw the machines running smoothly and the quality reports showing zero-tolerance deviations, they agreed to waive the contract penalties, satisfied that the supply chain was secure. For the next week, I finished my consulting retainer, helping Henry set up a new preventative maintenance schedule and locking the PLC configurations behind a secure encryption key that only the lead engineers could access. As for Brad Caldwell, the fallout from his short tenure was severe. The company's insurance provider refused to cover the $450,000 cost of the ruined stamping die, citing the manual bypass of the safety interlocks by an unlicensed contractor. Miller Precision Automotive's parent company filed a civil suit against Brad to recover the damages, using the server logs I had preserved to prove his direct orders to bypass the safety limits. His career in industrial operations was over, his reputation ruined in every manufacturing hub from Detroit to Chicago. On my last day at the plant, I packed my tools back into my box. I walked out to the production floor one last time, listening to the deep, steady heartbeat of the 4 Schuler presses. I had spent my entire adult life in this facility, and while the corporate names on the building might change, the machines would keep running, calibrated by the code I had written. I drove home, parked in my driveway, and walked back to my wooden ship. I had a lot of work to do on the rigging, and for the first time in 26 years, I had all the time in the world, a clear conscience, and a bank account that ensured I would never have to listen to an arrogant corporate suit ever again.